Charleston port records from 1798 list the arrival of a child described simply as female, 8 years, hair white as lamb's wool, purchased from Barbados estate sale. What makes this entry remarkable isn't the description. Albinism existed, though rarely documented, but what happened over the next 36 years? That same woman appears in 17 different plantation ledgers across Georgia and South Carolina, her distinctive appearance making her impossible to mistake. Medical journals from the 1820s reference examinations of a negress with congenital white hair, whose case physicians couldn't explain. But the mystery isn't medical, it's what plantation owners discovered about her value and why 5 different men paid increasingly desperate prices to own her, each one dying under circumstances that were never quite explained. The truth involves no supernatural elements, just human greed, a woman's impossible patience, and a secret about indigo cultivation that was worth killing for. Before we continue with the story of the woman Charleston society called Cotton, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. We uncover the darkest true stories from American history that textbooks won't touch. And comment below telling me what state or city you're watching from. I want to know where my audience is. Now let's discover what really happened to the most expensive piece of property in 3 states. Her real name, the one given at birth, was never recorded. The Barbados sugar plantation where she was born kept meticulous records of everything except the enslaved, listing barrels of molasses, pounds of sugar, even individual chickens, but reducing human beings to tally marks and physical descriptions. When the estate collapsed in 1798 after a hurricane destroyed 2/3 of the crop, everything was liquidated. Ships carried the wreckage to American ports, damaged equipment, remaining livestock, and 93 people sold to cover debts. The child arrived in Charleston with hair so white it looked like cotton ready for picking. Not the yellow white of some light-skinned people, not the gray of premature aging, but pure white, the color of fresh snow against her dark brown skin. Her eyes were normal, her skin showed no signs of albinism's usual sensitivity, just the hair, startling and impossible to hide. The auctioneer, Thomas Waverley, had processed thousands of sales. He understood markets, understood how to present merchandise for maximum profit. He saw immediately that the white hair made her memorable. Memorable was valuable. He invented a story on the spot, telling potential buyers she came from a line of house servants known for distinctive features, implying genetic traits that made her suitable for specialized work. A rice planter named Harrison Caldwell purchased her for $160, a premium price for a child, but Caldwell had ambitions. He named her Cotton, obvious and cruel, and assigned her to his wife's household in Beaufort. The next 8 years were unremarkable. She worked in the kitchen, learned household tasks, grew from child to teenager. Her hair stayed white. People stared. That was all. Everything changed in 1806 when Mrs. Caldwell's sister visited from Savannah. The sister, Margaret Sutherland, operated her own household and had sharp eyes for opportunity. She noticed Cotton wasn't just distinctive. She was attentive. She watched everything, remembered instructions after hearing them once, never made the same mistake twice. Margaret offered Harrison $600 for her, more than triple what he'd paid. Harrison refused initially, but Margaret was persistent. She explained her reasoning over dinner, loud enough that Cotton, serving wine, heard every word. She's wasted in a kitchen. That appearance makes her perfect for public-facing work, greeting guests, managing front-of-house operations. People will remember your household because they'll remember her. That's worth money in social circles. Harrison reconsidered. $600 was significant profit. He sold Cotton to Margaret, who transported her to Savannah that spring. Margaret's household was different. Smaller. Only 14 enslaved people, but operating at the center of Savannah's social scene. Margaret was wealthy, widowed, ambitious, and she used her household staff like theater props, everything designed to impress visitors, to cement her position in society. Cotton became the first person guests saw, positioned at the entrance, her white hair carefully styled, her dress always immaculate. Margaret coached her on posture, on how to speak to wealthy visitors, on memorizing names and preferences. Cotton learned quickly because failure meant being sold again, possibly to worse situations. She served in that role for 3 years, becoming known among Savannah's elite as the Sutherland woman with the extraordinary hair. The people asked Margaret about her, fascinated by the unusual appearance. Margaret encouraged the attention, implying exotic origins she'd invented, stories about rare bloodlines and distinctive heritage. Then Margaret's nephew arrived from England. James Sutherland was 24, recently arrived to manage inherited property in Georgia. He was educated, interested in botany and agriculture, and he noticed something nobody else had paid attention to. Cotton knew plants. He discovered this by accident. Finding her in the garden examining indigo plants, Margaret grew decoratively. Cotton was touching the leaves, smelling them, looking at the soil drainage. "Do you know indigo?" James asked. She hesitated before answering. Speaking to white men without being addressed first was dangerous. "I saw it growing in Barbados before I came here. The climate here is wrong for it. Too much rain, wrong soil composition. The soil could work. You'd need to add lime, improve drainage, plant in rows with spacing for air circulation." James was surprised. This wasn't casual observation. This was technical knowledge. "Where did you learn this?" "I watched the field workers in Barbados before the hurricane. They knew things about indigo that the overseers didn't know." James investigated further over the following weeks, asking Cotton questions about cultivation techniques, processing methods, dye extraction. Her knowledge was extensive and specific, information that could be worth substantial money if indigo could be profitably grown in Georgia. Indigo had been a major crop in South Carolina during the previous century, but production had declined as cotton became more profitable. However, European markets still paid premium prices for quality indigo dye. If someone could successfully revive cultivation, the profits would be enormous. James became obsessed with the idea. He researched indigo production, consulted with agricultural experts, and kept returning to Cotton for practical knowledge she'd absorbed as a child. He proposed to Margaret that they attempt experimental cultivation on property he'd inherited, 50 acres near the Ogeechee River. Margaret saw opportunity. She proposed a partnership. James would manage the agricultural operations, she would provide Cotton's knowledge and some financing, and they'd split profits. But there was a problem. Cotton was Margaret's property, and James needed consistent access to her expertise. They reached an arrangement. Margaret would lease Cotton to James for the growing season, essentially renting her knowledge for $200 plus a percentage of any profits from successful harvest. This arrangement, documented in letters between James and Margaret, was the beginning of Cotton's value transformation. She wasn't just distinctive property anymore. She possessed knowledge that could generate substantial wealth. The experimental indigo crop was planted in April 1809 on James Sutherland's property, 47 acres cleared and prepared according to specifications Cotton provided. James hired 12 people to work the fields, but Cotton supervised the actual cultivation, spacing, watering, soil treatment. James gave orders, but everyone understood they came from Cotton's knowledge. The arrangement was unusual enough to attract attention. Other planters heard about it, curious about the white-haired woman who knows indigo secrets. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as foolishness, taking agricultural advice from enslaved property. Others were intrigued, wondering if there was profit in knowledge that had been lost as indigo production declined. The crop grew well. By July, the plants were thriving, showing none of the diseases and growth problems that had plagued previous Georgia indigo attempts. James documented everything, keeping detailed notes about techniques Cotton suggested, results they observed, adjustments they made. Then 3 things happened in rapid succession, each one escalating tensions. First, a planter named Vincent Marrow visited the property in August, examining the crop and asking detailed questions. Marrow operated extensive holdings in South Carolina and had been trying unsuccessfully to revive indigo cultivation for years. He offered James $2,000 for cotton outright, specifically stating he wanted access to her knowledge about indigo processing. James refused, but word of the offer spread. $2,000 for a single enslaved woman was extraordinary. It signaled that cotton possessed value beyond normal property calculations. Second, Margaret Sutherland received a visit from a physician named Dr. Nathaniel Cross, who had heard about the unusual negress with white hair and agricultural knowledge. Cross wanted to examine cotton, to document her case for a medical paper he was writing about hereditary characteristics in the colored races. He offered Margaret $300 for access. Margaret considered accepting. $300 for a few hours of examination seemed like easy profit, but something made her hesitate. The timing coming right after Marrow's offer felt coordinated. She declined. Third, and most ominously, James received an anonymous letter in late August, delivered to his property by a rider who wouldn't identify himself. The letter was brief. The indigo knowledge she possesses was stolen from its rightful owners. Return her to Barbados authorities or face legal consequences. James showed the letter to Margaret. They discussed its implications. The claim about stolen knowledge was legally meaningless. Enslaved people couldn't own intellectual property. But the letter suggested someone was tracking Cotton's history, someone who saw her value and wanted to disrupt James's operations. They decided to increase security, keeping Cotton at the property rather than allowing her to move between locations. James hired 2 additional guards. They said nothing publicly, trying to avoid drawing more attention. The harvest approached in September. Indigo processing was complex. Timing was critical. Methods were precise. Mistakes could ruin the entire crop. Cotton supervised every step, directing workers through cutting, bundling, fermenting, and dye extraction. James watched, documented, learned. The final product was exceptional. The dye's quality matched the best imports from the Caribbean. James sent samples to buyers in Charleston and Savannah. Responses came back immediately. Everyone wanted to purchase. The projected profit from 47 acres was over $8,000, more than James had made from all his properties in the previous 2 years. That's when Vincent Marrow returned, this time with a lawyer and a magistrate. They arrived on October 3, 1809, just as the final dye processing was completing. Marrow carried documents. Purchase papers he claimed proved cotton was actually his property, sold to him by Harrison Caldwell in 1806 before Caldwell sold her to Margaret Sutherland. The documents looked legitimate. Dates, signatures, witness statements. Marrow claimed Caldwell had sold cotton twice, once to him, once to Margaret, and that Margaret's sale was fraudulent. James and Margaret examined the papers. The signatures looked genuine, the timeline was plausible. But something felt wrong. Caldwell had died 2 years earlier. He couldn't testify about which sale happened first. The magistrate, a man named Robert Thornton, reviewed the documents. Under Georgia law, property disputes required evidence. Both sales appeared documented. Without Caldwell to testify, and without clear proof of which transaction occurred first, Thornton had to make a judgment. He ruled in Marrow's favor, citing that Marrow's documents included a witness statement from a Charleston notary, while Margaret's sale had been processed informally. Cotton was to be transferred to Marrow's custody immediately, pending any appeal Margaret might file. Margaret was furious. She recognized the situation for what it was. Marrow had fabricated documents, probably forging Caldwell's signature, specifically to steal cotton now that her knowledge had proven valuable. But proving forgery would take months, require extensive legal proceedings, and Marrow would have cotton during the entire process. James pulled Margaret aside. If he takes her, we lose everything. He'll extract all the indigo knowledge, use it for his own operations, and we'll never see any of that $8,000. What are you suggesting? That we don't let him take her? Margaret understood immediately what he meant. Not legal resistance, physical resistance. Hide cotton, claim she'd run away. create enough confusion that Marrow couldn't easily take possession. But before they could act, Cotton herself did something unexpected. She walked directly to Vincent Marrow, looked him in the face and said clearly, "I won't work for you. You can own me legally, but I won't share what I know about Indigo. You'll have property that refuses to be profitable." Marrow smiled. "You'll work or face consequences. I've survived worse than anything you'll do. And knowledge can't be beaten out of someone. You need cooperation. I won't cooperate." It was the first time anyone had heard her speak so directly to a white man. The magistrate looked uncomfortable. James and Margaret were shocked. Marrow's smile faded. "We'll see about that," Marrow said. "Load her into the wagon." Two men Marrow had brought moved toward Cotton. That's when the situation exploded in violence nobody anticipated, violence that came not from Cotton, but from the 12 field workers who had spent months learning from her, who understood exactly what her knowledge meant for their own survival. The workers didn't attack. That would have meant immediate execution for everyone involved. Instead, they created chaos. Tools dropped loudly. Someone knocked over a vat of processed indigo dye. Another person started shouting about a fire that didn't exist. In the confusion, Cotton moved quickly toward the tree line bordering the property. James made a split-second decision. He shouted for everyone to help contain the fire, directing attention away from Cotton's movement. By the time Marrow realized what was happening, Cotton had disappeared into the woods. Marrow demanded immediate search. The magistrate, now deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, authorized it but only until nightfall. He wasn't going to deputize a manhunt for property dispute. Marrow's men searched for 3 hours, finding nothing. Cotton was gone. What nobody understood initially was that she hadn't run far. She was hiding less than a quarter mile from the main house in a storage building used for tobacco drying that sat abandoned. She stayed there for 4 days. Food and water brought secretly by one of the field workers, a woman named Patience, who had been at the property since before James's arrival. During those 4 days, everything shifted. Marrow filed legal complaints, demanding James and Margaret be charged with aiding an escape. Margaret hired a lawyer, who filed counter-complaints questioning Marrow's documents. The magistrate, regretting his hasty ruling, ordered both parties to appear in Savannah Court in 2 weeks with all evidence. James sent urgent letters to contacts in Charleston, trying to verify Marrow's purchase documents. He learned that Marrow had financial problems, substantial debts from failed agricultural ventures. The indigo operation was his attempt to recover losses, and Cotton's knowledge was central to that plan. Meanwhile, Cotton remained hidden, and during those 4 days, she made calculations about her situation. She understood the legal reality. Whoever won in court would own her. Running meant being caught eventually. Staying hidden indefinitely was impossible. But she had leverage nobody else recognized. The indigo knowledge in her memory was worth thousands of dollars, but only if she cooperated. Marrow needed her willing participation to profit. James needed her to complete current operations and train others. Margaret needed her to justify the legal expenses of fighting Marrow. On the 5th day, Cotton emerged from hiding. She walked directly to James's house early in the morning and asked to speak with him and Margaret together. "I have a proposal," she said. They listened, surprised by her directness. "Everyone wants my knowledge about indigo. Marrow wants it. You want it. Probably others will want it once they hear about the profits. But knowledge can't be stolen if I refuse to share it. So here's what I'm offering. I'll teach 3 people everything I know about indigo cultivation and processing. Complete knowledge transfer. But I choose who learns, and I need guarantees." James frowned. "You're enslaved property. You can't make demands. I can make offers. You need my cooperation. That gives me something to bargain with. Not freedom. I understand that's legally impossible right now. But treatment guarantees, written into whoever owns me. Limits on being sold again, limits on what work I can be forced into, written protections." Margaret was intrigued despite herself. "Written protections are worthless. Property has no enforceable rights." then write them as limitations on ownership. This property shall not be sold outside Georgia, shall not be subjected to field labor, shall not be made available for medical examination. Property can have restrictions that lower sale value, but protect the property itself. It was clever. Self-imposed limitations that reduced Cotton's theoretical value, but increased her practical security. James and Margaret exchanged glances. "And if we agree to these terms, you'll teach others your indigo knowledge?" James asked. "Everything I know. Complete transfer. Which means you don't need to keep me permanently after the knowledge is transferred. You could sell me to someone who wants a distinctive house servant, which is less complicated than owning someone with valuable agricultural expertise." The calculation was clear. Cotton was offering to decrease her own long-term value in exchange for short-term security and control over knowledge distribution. She was trying to make herself less valuable to people like Marrow, while making herself useful enough to James and Margaret that they'd protect her during the transfer period. Margaret smiled despite the situation. "You've thought about this carefully. I've had nothing but time to think for 14 years. Can we make this arrangement?" James considered. The legal battle with Marrow would cost money regardless. If they won, they'd have Cotton, but she might refuse to cooperate, making ownership worthless. If they lost, Marrow would have the same problem. But if they created written restrictions before the court ruling, whoever won would be bound by terms that gave Cotton some protection. "I'll draft a document," James said. "Limitations on ownership, as you described. But Margaret still owns you until the court rules, and if Marrow wins, he'd be subject to the same restrictions." "That's acceptable. When do we start the knowledge transfer?" "Now, before anything else happens." For the next 9 days, Cotton taught 3 people, James, Patience, and a field worker named Samuel, everything she knew about indigo. Cultivation methods, timing, soil treatment, processing techniques, quality assessment. She was methodical and thorough, understanding this was her only chance to distribute the knowledge before courts decided her fate. James documented everything in detailed notes. By day 7, he had enough information to replicate the operation without Cotton's presence. By day 9, Patience and Samuel could explain the entire process start to finish. The court hearing happened in Savannah on October 19, 1809. Both sides presented evidence. Margaret's lawyer demonstrated problems with Marrow's documents. The witness signature didn't match the notary's signature on file in Charleston. The paper type wasn't used until 1807, after the claimed 1806 sale. The wax seal was wrong for the period. Marrow's documents were forgeries. The magistrate ruled in Margaret's favor. Cotton remained her property. Marrow was ordered to pay legal costs and was suspected of fraud, though charges weren't formally filed. But the situation had changed fundamentally. Cotton's knowledge was no longer unique. 3 other people now possessed it. Her value had decreased exactly as she'd planned, and the written restrictions James had created were now part of her documentation, limitations that would follow her through any future sale. Margaret kept Cotton for another 3 years, during which the indigo operation continued successfully. James trained additional workers using the documented knowledge. The operation so we eliminated the problem. Cotton stopped reading, her heart pounding. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the letter clutched in both hands, trying to process words that rewrote everything she understood about 1809. She remembered hearing about Marrow's death in November that year. It had been reported as a tragic accident. His wagon had broken down on a muddy road near the Ogeechee River, gone into the water during a rainstorm. Marrow had drowned before anyone could help. The news had reached James Sutherland's property 3 days after it happened. She had felt relief at the time. Guilty relief that the threat was gone. That she wouldn't have to worry about Marrow fabricating more documents or attempting another legal challenge. She had never suspected murder. The letter continued, and Patience's words became more detailed, more confessional. "We planned it for a week. Samuel knew the roads Marrow traveled. He'd been hired out for wagon repair work, and he understood axles. understood exactly where to weaken one so it would hold for a few miles, then fail at a specific point. We chose the curve near the Ogichi because everyone knew that road was dangerous in rain, because wagons had gone into the river there before, because nobody would question it. We waited for rain. It came on November 18th, heavy afternoon storm. Maro was traveling back from Savannah to his property. We knew his route. Samuel had already weakened the axle 3 days earlier when Maro's wagon was at a blacksmith shop. Samuel was working there temporarily, had access to tools and the wagon, and nobody questioned a black man doing repair work. The axle held until the curve. We were watching from the trees. We heard it break, heard the wagon tip, heard Maro shouting as it went into the water. The river was high from rain. Current was strong. His wagon overturned, trapping him underneath. We could have helped. We could have pulled him out. We watched him drown instead. It took maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes of him struggling, shouting, then going quiet. We waited another 10 minutes to be certain. Then we left. A farmer found the wreckage the next morning. Everyone assumed it was an accident. Nobody investigated carefully. White men died in wagon accidents regularly, and Maro wasn't important enough for anyone to care about details. Cotton felt cold spreading through her chest. She had known these people. Patience, who had brought her food during those 4 days of hiding. Samuel, who had learned indigo processing with such careful attention. 4 others whose names Patience hadn't mentioned, probably for their own protection, in case this letter was ever discovered. The letter's tone shifted. You need to understand why we did this. The knowledge you shared with James and Samuel and me, that wasn't just about indigo. That was about dignity. You showed us that our knowledge had value, that we knew things planters didn't know, that our minds were worth something beyond labor. When Maro tried to steal that, tried to take you and exploit what you knew, he was telling us that nothing we knew mattered, that we had no right to knowledge. We couldn't let that stand. We knew you'd never agree to killing him. You were always careful, always trying to make yourself less valuable, less threatening. But sometimes threats don't go away by hiding. Sometimes you have to eliminate them. So we made that choice for you. And we've carried it for 27 years, never telling anyone, never even talking about it among ourselves after it was done. Samuel died last year. Heart gave out while he was working in the fields. He was 63. Before he died, he made me promise I'd tell you the truth. He said you deserve to know that your safety came at a cost. We murdered a white man to protect you. All 6 of us could have been hanged if anyone had discovered the truth. We accepted that risk because what you gave us, the knowledge, the dignity, the proof that we had minds worth respecting, was worth protecting. I don't regret it. None of us ever did. But you should know the truth. If I die without telling you, then I die carrying something that's partly yours to carry. I'm 59 years old. I've lived almost 30 more years than I expected to live, and every one of those years I've known I was a murderer. It doesn't bother me the way people say it should. I sleep fine. But I wanted you to know. The letter ended with Patience's signature, shaky but deliberate. Cotton sat holding the letter for over an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Her small room was dark except for a single candle. Outside she could hear the sounds of Richmond at night, distant voices, horses on cobblestones, the occasional bark of a dog. She thought about Vincent Maro drowning in the Ogichi River. She tried to remember what he looked like. Thin face, sharp eyes, expensive clothes that were slightly worn at the edges. The appearance of wealth maintained despite financial problems. He had been perhaps 40 years old when he died. He had been desperate, certainly. Probably cruel, given how he'd planned to exploit her. But did desperation and cruelty justify murder? She thought about Patience and Samuel and 4 others whose names she'd never know, watching from the trees as a man drowned. What had they felt? Relief? Guilt? Satisfaction? Fear that someone would discover what they'd done? She thought about the risk they'd taken. Murdering a white man was among the most dangerous things enslaved people could do. If discovered, All 6 would have been executed, probably tortured first as example and deterrent. Their deaths would have been public, brutal, designed to terrify others into compliance. They had accepted that risk to protect her, to protect knowledge, to protect something intangible about dignity and worth. Cotton realized she was crying, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Grief for Marrow, gratitude for protection, horror at violence done in her name, guilt that she'd benefited from murder without knowing. All of those things mixed together into something too complex for simple emotion. She stood slowly, walked to the fireplace in the kitchen where coals still glowed from evening cooking. She held the letter over the heat, watching it catch fire, watching Patience's confession burn. Evidence destroyed. Nobody would ever prove what happened on that rainy November afternoon in 1809. The 6 murderers would die with their secret, and now Cotton would carry it alone. She returned to her room, lay on her narrow bed, stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the 4 minutes Marrow had struggled underwater, about Patience and Samuel watching, about the calculation they'd made, that one white man's life was worth trading for her safety and their dignity. The next morning she woke before dawn and went about her duties in the Grayson household with perfect normalcy. She served breakfast, cleaned rooms, managed household supplies, interacted with Richard Grayson and his family with appropriate deference. Nothing in her behavior suggested anything had changed, but internally, something fundamental had shifted. For 27 years, she had understood her survival as the result of her own careful strategy, distributing knowledge, managing her value, making herself unremarkable. Now she understood that her survival had also required violence she hadn't chosen and hadn't known about. Her careful planning had been insufficient. Protection had come from people who loved her enough to commit murder. Over the following weeks, Cotton tried to process this knowledge. She had no one to talk to about it. Discussing it would endanger anyone who knew. She carried it in silence, adding it to the growing weight of things she remembered but couldn't speak about. She thought about writing back to Patience but realized she had no address, and Patience had said she was dying. By the time any letter could reach Georgia, Patience would likely be gone. And what would she say? "Thank you for murdering someone to protect me. I'm sorry you carried that guilt for decades. I wish you hadn't told me." In May 1836, 2 months after receiving the letter, Cotton learned through merchant networks that an older woman named Patience had died on James Sutherland's property in Georgia. The information came indirectly. A traveling merchant mentioned it casually while discussing business in Georgia, not knowing Cotton had any connection. Cotton felt the loss physically, like something important had been cut away. Patience had been 61, had survived decades of slavery, had carried the weight of murder for most of her adult life, and had died still enslaved on the same property where the conspiracy had begun. Cotton would never be able to ask her questions, never be able to acknowledge what Patience had done, never be able to say the things that felt important but impossible to articulate. She requested permission from Richard Grayson to attend a church service that Sunday, something she rarely did, as she had complicated feelings about religion that had been used to justify her enslavement. Grayson approved, probably seeing it as evidence of appropriate moral character. Cotton sat in the segregated back section of a Richmond church, listening to a preacher talk about forgiveness and redemption, and thought about murder and survival, and the impossible moral calculations enslaved people had to make. She didn't pray. She wasn't certain what she believed about God or justice or any of the concepts the preacher discussed. But she sat quietly, remembering Patience, acknowledging in her own mind the debt she owed to someone who had committed violence to protect her. After the service, walking back to the Grayson household through Richmond streets, Cotton made a decision. She would carry this secret for the rest of her life. She would never tell anyone what Patience had confessed. She would protect the 6 conspirators' memories the same way they had protected her, through silence, through careful management of information, through understanding that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. But she would also never forget. She would remember Patience's shaky handwriting, Samuel's careful learning of indigo techniques, the unnamed four who had stood in trees watching a man drown. She would remember that her survival hadn't been purely her own accomplishment, that other people had made terrible choices so she could continue existing. For the next 8 years, Cotton worked in the Grayson household with that knowledge sitting heavy in her memory. She never spoke of it. She never gave any indication that she carried information about an 1809 murder. She simply continued her careful, unremarkable existence, aging into her 50s, her white hair now clearly the white of age rather than unique condition. Richard Grayson died in 1844 from complications of pneumonia. He was 68 years old, had been kind in the distant, impersonal way some slave owners practiced kindness, treating enslaved people well because it made economic sense, not because he questioned the fundamental immorality of ownership. Cotton had worked for him for 18 years, longer than she'd worked for anyone else. His death meant uncertainty about her future. Grayson's estate was settled by a nephew from Petersburg, a younger man named William Grayson, who had inherited substantial property but no interest in maintaining his uncle's Richmond household. William decided to liquidate everything. The house would be sold, furniture auctioned, enslaved people distributed or sold. Cotton was 54 years old. The written restrictions that had followed her through multiple sales still applied, though by now they were almost irrelevant. She was too old for most of the exploitations they protected against. Medical examination of a middle-aged woman with white hair held no scientific interest. Agricultural knowledge about indigo was outdated. Exhibition as a curiosity required someone young and unusual-looking, not someone aging into ordinariness. William Grayson sold Cotton to a Richmond lawyer named Edward Marsh for $180. The price reflected her age, her limited remaining working years, and the restrictions that technically lowered her value, even though they no longer mattered practically. Marsh purchased her because he needed experienced household management, and Cotton's reputation for competence had value. She worked for Marsh for 7 years, managing his household, supervising 2 younger enslaved women, maintaining the kind of orderly domesticity that lawyers appreciated. Marsh was methodical, precise, and largely absent. He worked long hours, traveled frequently, and cared about his household only insofar as it functioned without requiring his attention. Cotton provided exactly that. She was efficient, invisible, unremarkable. She was in her late 50s, her hair was completely white, her hands showed arthritis, her movements were slower than they'd been. She looked like what she was, an aging woman who had spent decades in slavery, wearing down under the accumulated weight of years. In 1851, Marsh's financial situation changed. He had made poor investments in a railroad venture that collapsed. He needed to reduce expenses. At 61 years old, Cotton was expensive to maintain relative to her remaining productive years. Marsh sold her to a boarding house operator named Susan Hartwell for $90. The price drop was significant. From $180 to $90 in 7 years, her value was declining rapidly as she aged past 60. Susan Hartwell purchased her because experienced household help was valuable, but she negotiated hard on price, understanding that Cotton's working years were limited. Cotton worked at Hartwell's boarding house for 3 years, cleaning rooms, managing linens, supervising kitchen work. It was harder labor than she'd done for Marsh, more physical, more demanding. Her arthritis worsened. Her back hurt constantly. She was 64 years old and feeling every year. In 1854, Susan Hartwell sold her to a small household operated by a tobacco merchant's widow for $70. Then in 1857, to another household for $55. Her price kept dropping as she aged into her late 60s, as her physical capacity diminished, as her value approached zero. In 1859, she was sold for the final time, for $45, to a widow named Catherine Wells, who needed household help and wanted someone too old to run away, too worn down to cause trouble. Cotton was 69 years old. She worked for Catherine Wells for 2 years, doing increasingly light work as her physical capacity declined. She cleaned when she could, mended clothes, supervised younger workers when Catherine acquired them temporarily. She was aging into uselessness in a system that valued people only for their labor capacity. Then in April 1861, the Civil War began. Catherine's household dissolved rapidly. Her two sons left to fight for the Confederacy. Her resources disappeared into war financing. Her ability to maintain a household evaporated. In June 1861, Catherine fled to relatives in North Carolina, taking portable valuables and leaving everything else, including 3 elderly enslaved people who were too old to transport and too valueless to sell. Cotton found herself effectively free, not through manumission, but through abandonment. The house sat empty. The 3 abandoned people, Cotton, an elderly man named Joseph, and a woman named Ruth, occupied it for several weeks, uncertain what to do. Eventually, Union sympathizers in Richmond helped them relocate to a boarding house that housed free blacks and abandoned enslaved people. A precarious existence in a Confederate capital, but better than starving in an empty house. Cotton lived there through the war years, working odd jobs when she could find them, depending partly on charity from free black communities, surviving day to day. She was in her 70s, too old for most work, too worn down for anything demanding. But she was also free, in the practical sense that nobody claimed ownership, nobody controlled her movements, nobody could sell her. When Union troops occupied Richmond in April 1865, formal emancipation meant little to her practically. She'd been functioning as free for 4 years already. But psychologically, legally, it meant everything. At 75 years old, she was finally, unambiguously, undeniably free. The years immediately after emancipation were chaos. Richmond was destroyed. Buildings burned, infrastructure collapsed, the economy evaporated. Formerly enslaved people flooded into the city, looking for work, looking for family, trying to build lives in the wreckage. Cotton was 75 years old, which made her ancient by the standards of people who had spent decades in slavery. Most people she had known were dead. She found work as a seamstress, her arthritic hands still capable of delicate stitching, her decades of experience with textile work translating into something marketable. She shared a room with 2 other elderly women in a boarding house on Clay Street, in what had become Richmond's free black neighborhood. She earned barely enough to survive, but survival felt like victory. She thought often about Patience's confession. The knowledge of the murder sat in her memory, another weight among many. She had survived 9 sales, 36 years of slavery, abandonment, war, and reconstruction. She had outlived everyone who had owned her, everyone who had exploited her knowledge, everyone who had tried to study her or exhibit her or extract value from her existence. Vincent Marrow had been dead for 56 years. His drowning in the Ogeechee River was recorded in historical records as accidental. Nobody questioned it. Nobody investigated. The 6 people who had murdered him were dead too. Patience, Samuel, and 4 whose names Cotton never knew. Their secret had died with them, except for Cotton's memory. In 1872, at age 82, Cotton was interviewed by a young schoolteacher named David Harper, who was documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences. Harper was 26, idealistic, earnest in the way young people often are about historical preservation. He had been born free in Pennsylvania, had come south after the war to teach, and was trying to collect testimonies before the generation that had lived through slavery died. He found Cotton through recommendations from other elderly people in Richmond's free black community. He arrived at her boarding house on a warm afternoon in May, carrying a notebook and pencil, explaining his project with enthusiasm that made Cotton feel tired. "I want to record your experiences," he said. "Everything you remember about slavery, about the people who owned you, about how you survived. These stories need to be preserved." Cotton studied him. He was young, well-meaning, and had no idea what he was asking. "I've been alive 82 years, she said. "I've been enslaved for 75 of them. That's a lot of experiences. We can take as much time as you need. Multiple sessions, whatever you're willing to share. Cotton agreed, partly because she was flattered by the attention, partly because she understood the importance of documentation, partly because at 82 years old, she had little else to do with her time. Over 3 days in May 1872, David Harper interviewed Cotton for a total of approximately 9 hours. His notes, preserved in Richmond Historical Society archives, provide the most detailed account of her life. He recorded her testimony in careful handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, mostly just listening as Cotton talked through decades of memory. She told him about being sold 9 times, about the white hair that had made her distinctive, about learning indigo cultivation in Barbados and teaching it in Georgia, about the legal dispute with Vincent Marrow and the court case in 1809, about working in Charleston's social circles, about Dr. Nathaniel Cross's attempts to study her, about fleeing to Richmond to avoid medical examination, about the declining prices as she aged, about abandonment during the Civil War, about emancipation coming too late to matter much practically. She was selective in what she shared. She described the indigo knowledge in general terms, but didn't provide specific technical details. That knowledge was hers, and she had distributed it deliberately in 1809, and she wasn't giving it away again to some young northern teacher. She mentioned people by name when she remembered them, but changed some names, protecting people whose descendants might still be alive and vulnerable. And she never mentioned Vincent Marrow's murder. That secret she kept locked in her memory, protecting Patience and Samuel, and the unnamed 4 even in death. Harper wrote that Marrow had died in an accident, because that's what Cotton told him, and Harper had no reason to question it. Near the end of the 3rd day of interviews, Harper asked Cotton a question that made her pause. Looking back over your life, over everything that happened, do you think things worked out the way you planned? When you distributed that indigo knowledge in 1809, when you made yourself less valuable deliberately, did that strategy succeed? Cotton considered the question carefully. I survived, she said finally. I'm 82 years old. Most people born into slavery in 1790 didn't live this long. Most people sold 9 times didn't survive. So in that sense, yes, the strategy worked. But was it more than survival? Did you get what you wanted? I wanted to not be studied like a specimen. I wanted to not be exhibited. I wanted to not be valuable enough that people would go to extreme lengths to own me. I achieved all of that. By the time I was 40, I was unremarkable. By the time I was 60, I was almost worthless in market terms. That's exactly what I worked toward. Do you regret it? Making yourself less valuable? Giving away knowledge that was worth thousands of dollars? Cotton smiled, a tired expression. The knowledge was worth thousands of dollars to the people who owned me. It was worth survival to me. Those are different kinds of value. I don't regret choosing survival. Harper wrote this down, nodding. He asked a few more questions, then thanked Cotton for her time and promised to preserve her testimony carefully. She never saw him again. She never learned what happened to his documentation project, whether anyone read the testimonies he collected, whether her story mattered to anyone beyond that moment. She continued living in Richmond for 2 more years after the interview. She worked when she could, mostly small sewing jobs. Her arthritis worsened. Her eyesight declined. She was increasingly dependent on the charity of the free black community, particularly a church on Broad Street that provided meals and occasional financial help to elderly people. In December 1873, she fell ill with a respiratory infection. It worsened into pneumonia over the following weeks. She was treated by a black physician named Dr. Thomas Freeman, who did what he could with limited resources, but at 83 years old, with lungs weakened by decades of poor living conditions, Cotton had little capacity to fight serious illness. She died on February 14, 1874, in her room in the Clay Street boarding house. Dr. Freeman signed the death certificate, listing cause of death as pneumonia, age as 83 years. She was buried 3 days later in a cemetery for free blacks and formerly enslaved people, in an unmarked grave because headstones cost money nobody had. The burial was attended by perhaps a dozen people, other residents of the boarding house, a few members of the Broad Street Church, Dr. Freeman. No family, because Cotton had no surviving family that anyone knew about. No one from her decades in slavery, because everyone from that period was dead. A minister from the church said a few words about resurrection and eternal rest. Someone sang a hymn. They lowered Cotton into the ground in a simple wooden coffin, and that was the end of her physical existence. But memory persisted in fragments. David Harper's 1872 interview notes survived in Richmond Historical Society archives. James Sutherland's indigo cultivation documents survived in a Georgia agricultural museum. Dr. Nathaniel Cross's unpublished medical paper survived in Charleston Medical College archives. Plantation ledgers survived in various state historical collections, documenting sales of cotton distinctive white hair, with prices declining from $600 to $45 over 36 years. These fragments sat in archives for decades, unconnected, each telling part of a story nobody assembled into coherent narrative. The murder of Vincent Marrow remained documented as accidental drowning. Patience's confession died with cotton, destroyed in flames. The 6 conspirators' identities were never recorded. In 1892, 18 years after Cotton's death, a Georgia historian named Edmund Wallace, researching early agricultural experiments, found James Sutherland's indigo notes. Wallace published an article in the Georgia Historical Quarterly titled "Forgotten Agricultural Innovations of the Early Republic." The article mentioned an enslaved woman with specialized knowledge from Barbados, but didn't include her name or detailed description. The white hair, the multiple sales, the calculated strategy of self-devaluation, none of that made it into Wallace's article. In 1901, a medical historian researching unusual anatomical cases found Dr. Cross's unpublished paper in Charleston archives. He included it in a book about curious medical observations from the antebellum period, treating Cotton's case as interesting but unverifiable anecdote, one of dozens of unusual cases Cross had documented over his career. In 1968, a graduate student named Patricia Morrison, researching free black communities in Reconstruction Richmond, found David Harper's interview notes in the Richmond Historical Society. She included excerpts in her dissertation about formerly enslaved women's survival strategies. But the dissertation was read by perhaps 20 people and never published as a book. These fragments existed separately, archived in different institutions, documented by different researchers with different interests. Nobody connected them into a single narrative about one woman who had been sold 9 times, who had possessed valuable knowledge she deliberately distributed to reduce her own market value, who had survived by making herself unremarkable, who had been protected by people willing to commit murder, who had carried that knowledge silently to her grave. The cemetery where Cotton was buried was developed over in 1923 as Richmond expanded. Bodies were supposed to be relocated to a consolidated location, but records were incomplete, identifications were uncertain, and many graves were simply built over. Cotton's unmarked grave disappeared under a grocery store, then decades later a parking lot, then eventually an apartment building. Her physical remains are somewhere under modern Richmond, location unknown, identity forgotten. What survives is documentation without narrative. Archival fragments that prove she existed but don't explain who she was. Sale records, medical observations, agricultural notes, interview transcripts, pieces of a life scattered across multiple archives in multiple states, waiting for someone to connect them. And the question remains, was Cotton's strategy successful? She survived 9 sales, multiple threats of exploitation, decades of slavery, and died free at 83. She achieved the unremarkability she worked toward, making herself invisible enough to survive. But survival required violence she didn't choose, protection from people who loved her enough to murder, secrets that followed her to her grave. She distributed knowledge that was worth thousands of dollars, receiving nothing in return except marginal safety. She carried perfect memory of everyone who owned her, everyone who bought and sold her, everyone who tried to exploit her, and never spoke most of it aloud. She knew about murder and never told anyone. She survived through calculation, through careful management of her own value in a system designed to extract maximum value from human beings. Was that success? Or just the least terrible outcome available within an impossible situation? The historical record can't answer those questions. We have facts, dates, prices, locations, events. But meaning requires interior knowledge we don't possess. Cotton left no detailed memoirs, no extensive testimony beyond Harper's brief interview. We know what happened to her, but not how she felt about what happened, not what calculations ran through her mind, not what she believed about justice or revenge or survival. We know she existed. We know she was remarkable. We know she worked deliberately to become unremarkable. Whether that represents triumph or tragedy or simply survival is a question each person must answer for themselves, based on what they believe about autonomy, strategy, and the impossible choices slavery forced people to make. Cotton's story challenges simple narratives about resistance and survival. She didn't lead revolts. She didn't escape dramatically to freedom. She didn't even achieve freedom through her own actions. Freedom came through abandonment and war, circumstances beyond her control. What she did was survive through calculation, through strategic self-diminishment, through understanding systems well enough to manipulate her position within them slightly, marginally, just enough to avoid the worst outcomes. Is that resistance? Is that agency? Or is it just survival? Doing what had to be done to exist another day, another year, another decade? The answer probably depends on what we need the story to be, what lessons we want to draw, what beliefs we hold about human capacity for strategy and resistance under conditions of total domination. What seems undeniable is that Cotton was intelligent, calculating, and strategic in ways that contradict every justification slavery's defenders offered for the institution. She possessed knowledge planters valued. She understood market dynamics well enough to manipulate her own price. She made choices about knowledge distribution that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic systems. She survived through cognitive abilities that slavery's entire ideological structure insisted were impossible for enslaved people to possess. Her existence was evidence against slavery's foundations. But that evidence was scattered, archived, fragmented, never assembled into narrative that could challenge anything. She was proof that the system was built on lies, but proof that nobody saw, that remained buried in archives for over a century. And maybe that's the final tragedy. Not that Cotton died in obscurity. Many people do. Not that her story was fragmented. Many stories are. But that her remarkable life, her strategic survival, her devastating intelligence existed as evidence of slavery's cruelty and contradiction. And nobody assembled that evidence into argument that mattered, while it could have mattered. She survived. She was free when she died. She outlived everyone who owned her. In those limited terms, she succeeded. But the larger questions about justice, about restitution, about whether survival counts as victory when survival required such terrible compromises, those questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Certainly unresolved. What do you think about Cotton's story? Was her strategy of deliberately decreasing her own value successful, or was it just the least terrible option available? And what about Patience's confession? Was protecting Cotton from knowledge of the murder actually mercy? Or did Cotton deserve to know the full cost of her survival? These are questions without easy answers, questions that require us to think carefully about autonomy, violence, protection, and what counts as success when all your choices are constrained by systems designed to destroy you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as complex and troubling as I did, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the difficult historical stories we uncover every week. Share this with anyone who appreciates complicated truths about our past. Truths that don't fit into simple narratives about heroes and villains. Until next time, Remember that history is full of people whose stories challenge everything we think we know about survival, resistance, and what it means to live with dignity under conditions designed to deny dignity entirely.